everybody, this is Leila, Health Education Manager here at AiArthritis, and I am back again with my fourth debrief and super excited to let you know about what I learned today. So I am excited to talk to you about cognitive dysfunction because it is something that so many people in our community experience, and they also don't know why it happens or what to do sometimes or how even to approach it. And it can be a very frustrating thing to go through. I personally have dealt with cognitive dysfunction issues, and so I will talk a little bit about that throughout my debrief. And the patient who spoke, she everything that she said resonated with me so much that I made my husband watch part of the session because my cognitive dysfunction has been very active the past few months, and it's been a big topic in my household. So I am excited to basically talk to you about what has been said in this session. So let's dive in. I thought it would be very helpful to share the slides for this part of the debrief, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. So she talks about how her level of cognitive functioning was before she got diagnosed with her disease. She was dealing with serious and time-sensitive issues, working with CPS, like Child Protective Services, and responsibility for vulnerable children and families, need to multitask, work under pressure, ability to plan and organize, flexibility, focus and concentration, listening and observing skills, and being attentive for and adapt to threatening or escalating situations. And after, she talks about how her symptoms were all over the place. So she did a little bit of like a visual exercise of showing how all over the place our symptoms for cognitive dysfunction can be. I copied and pasted a whole blurb of what she was saying, and I just wanted to highlight a few things. This is the part that really resonated with me. And when working on my laptop, I'm very easily distracted. I'm pretty sure many people recognize that. When I was still working as a counselor, I worked on 3 or 4 different files at a time, and now I have to just take one task, and it's difficult. I end up after 30 minutes, I look at it at the bottom of my screen, and there's 12 screens open, and I started reading emails, started replying to some of them, but never finished up, and etc. And even administration, like reading, filling in forms or reading instructions or following steps in a procedure, they can really stress me out acutely to the extent that I end up in tears or with an elevated heart rate. So she talks here a little bit about the consequences of the brain fog and the things that happen. And I think really for me, the feelings of shame and failure, frustration and denial, and feeling insecure or overconfident, it's been really big for me. And I think whenever I get stressed out so easily, I get overstimulated, I have a hard time initiating tasks, and I have to really hype myself up to go ahead and start a task. And it's been really hard. And I tried to get tested for ADHD because I thought that's what it was. And as we were going through the tests, we came to the conclusion that it's all through cognitive dysfunction that all of these things are happening. So this really hits home for me. I totally understand what she's saying. And here is the biggest part. What can we do about it? What helps her? What can we try to organize our brain and help us make sure that we don't forget things? And so taking breaks is very important. Doing puzzles/memory games, plan my day and stick to it. Developing routines, work in silence, or put a special playlist together that helps you focus instead of distracts you. Being physically active helps her as well. Doing a to-do list and prioritizing, asking for help or taking a step back, being outdoors, shutting out sensory stimuli when tired, humor, and putting things into perspective. And it feels like she was talking to me during this session. So this was a really good session for me. And for the patient session, this is the rest of her take-home points. So cognitive dysfunction can show in many shapes and forms. The patient may not realize the extent or maybe overcompensating or masking symptoms. It is up to the healthcare professionals to address the topic. Try not to ask, but also look for the signs. A small problem may have huge impact. Psychoeducation, informing and educating patients can help empower them. And dealing with cognitive dysfunction is hard work, especially when already dealing with an RMD or an AI arthritis disease. And so that was the patient segment of the session. And I am going to move on to the next part of the session. And this was a very interesting diagram that the speaker showed. It's basically showing the correlations between all of these different symptoms and cognitive dysfunction and how it can affect. There's other factors like vitamin deficiencies, other diseases, but everything that's on here can contribute to cognitive dysfunction, and just trying to address all of those different things that can affect it. And so this speaker tried to accumulate all of the different studies that had to do with cognitive dysfunction in order to do a overview of recommendations and explanation and management of cognitive dysfunction. There are other things that you can check out just to double check if there's something else wrong, if these signs of cognitive dysfunction are happening. Some things to look at could be any structural brain alterations, cardiovascular, vitamin D deficiency, hypothyroidism, vitamin B12 or folate deficiency, and the different drugs that can be causing this, such as antipsychotics or anything having codeine, benzodiazepines, things like that. The speaker also says that there aren't many studies just fully done on cognitive dysfunction. Usually they're focusing on something else, and then they have cognitive dysfunction as part of their research. So there aren't many cognitive dysfunction dedicated research studies. The biggest thing that you can do to help manage cognitive dysfunction, though, is treating the underlying disease. I tend to see that whenever my infusion is due, within like maybe 3 or 4 days, is when my brain fog is at its peak. Either that or when I'm extremely stressed out and I know that I can probably be flaring. So either in a flare or right before I need my infusion is when I am usually experiencing more intense cognitive dysfunction. So making sure that you treat the underlying disease is the main thing that you can do. They also do talk about recommending to see an occupational therapy, seeing if your insurance would pay for an occupational therapy to help you with trying to cope with all of these different symptoms and how it affects your daily life, and coming up with those routines with you and coming up with mechanisms in order to remember things. That's what occupational therapists do. They help us to live our everyday life with whatever ailment we may have at that time. And the conclusion from this segment was results tentatively indicate that levels and change of cognitive dysfunction correlate with fatigue, pain, physical inactivity, psychological distress, and sleep problems, and treating those associated factors according to existing recommendations are points to consider. So if you're not sleeping well, if you have anxiety and depression, those can definitely exacerbate cognitive dysfunction, as well as fatigue and pain and any inactivity with exercising and things like that. The last segment talks about very specific screening tools. So they bring up 3 different screening tools, which is 1, the mini mental state examination, 2, the Addenbrooke's cognitive examination number 3, and the Montreal cognitive assessment test, or the MoCA test. And with the mini mental state examination, I'm familiar with that because I used to work in senior care. So that is used a lot for seniors and for dementia testing. And so another self-report tool is mostly our questionnaires, and this one is called MASQ, MASQ, and it's the Multiple Abilities Self-Report Questionnaire. It's a 38-item measure of self-perception of cognitive difficulties, and it focuses on language, perception, verbal memory, visual memory, and attention and concentration. And so that can still be a hard test for some people to take because it is extensive. It's 38 items. And so they also did mention another one that's called the Multidimensional Inventory of Subjective Cognitive Impairment, or MISCI, MISCI. There's 10 items on there, and you basically rate them. And it has to do with clearly thinking without extra effort, mind being sharp, remembering things, concentrating, shifting back and forth between activities. That's a really big one for me. It says I have had trouble shifting back and forth between different activities that require thinking. I call it a buffer time, but usually my buffer time between switching tasks is anywhere between 10 to 20 minutes, and it can be very frustrating to have to recenter myself again. Having trouble planning out the steps of a task, that is always very hard for me as well. And trouble finding the right words, or trouble expressing myself clearly. So those are like the indicators of this test on whether or not someone is experiencing mild, moderate, or extreme or severe cognitive dysfunction. Focus on the impact of the cognitive dysfunction and the management of the other variables, and not so much the actual symptoms, but helping to manage what the symptoms cause, because unfortunately there is not much that we can do, or that we have found that we can do to help treat cognitive dysfunction besides treating underlying conditions and learning how to cope with it. And so that was my debrief for today. I hope that you enjoyed it and that you learned something, or at least felt heard. If cognitive dysfunction is something that you might be experiencing, I know it could be very lonely and isolating, but it's good to know that they are starting to do some research in this sector, and hopefully in the next few years, we might even have a medication or something else that explains or helps with cognitive dysfunction. Thank you again for joining us this time around for our Go With Us program to EULAR 2024. Thank you so much again, and I will see you later. Bye.